Welcome to Chapter 2 of The Conquered, a Guyver future o fanfiction. Thank you for listening. Let's begin. The Conquered, Chapter 2, Humanity. The day Cronus fell cannot be determined and pinned down to a singular point in time. The beginning of that fall can be directly traced to Alkenfal's death, but the day that Cronus was no longer considered a major threat is far more elusive. There were gradual steps taken, 6 months to a year after Sho defeated Alkenfal, and although no treaties were signed. In that year Cronus was chased into the wilderness and civilian government was returned. Although 6 months is not a long time, it seemed longer, the process to return rulership to the people much longer. Zeus Thunderbolt worked tirelessly through that time, Agito personally destroying many of the Cronus forces who continued to fight. It was during that time his forces became known worldwide and the depth of their fight against Cronus became known. During Cronus' rule the countries that had existed previously were declared extinct, but after Cronus' fall a few re-emerged: Democratic America, Majestic Britain, Imperial Japan, the People's China, Historic India and Black South Africa, although they were changed. The world's political ground had been changed forever. Democratic America now took in about half of Canada and Mexico. Majestic Britain controlled most of Europe with a move of economic superiority. Imperial Japan controlled many small islands around it but was unable to move on to the mainland because of the People's China. The People's China controlled a large swath of Russia, and many of the smaller countries it had formerly claimed were provinces, although I know the bloodshed was massive. Historic India was squeezed between the People's China and the Islamic East, but it had managed to remain a country, growing its borders slightly. Black South Africa controlled the southern half of the continent. Their names are recognizable as countries before and after Cronus, but their borders were very different. Cronus had controlled the world, dividing it up between 10 Zolords, with Alkenfal overseeing the whole and Murakami being his messenger. The other powers to emerge in the post-Cronus world were the Islamic East, Oceania, the Middle Europe, Greater Brazil, Unified Chile, the Desert Alliance and the Southern Worlds. Greater Brazil and Unified Chile controlled the whole of the South American continent but were more concerned with fighting each other than forming a new world. The Middle Europe was locked between 3 other powers: the People's China, the Islamic East and Majestic Britain. The Desert Alliance was a collection of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes that wandered the Sahara and the countries around that. The Southern Worlds and Oceania controlled the Pacific and India Oceans. And that was how the world was divided. 13 governments, both civilian and military, who had fought in some way against Cronus. Zeus Thunderbolt soldiers were recognized and welcomed in all countries, and with Agito's blessings his forces broke up, assimilating back into their respective communities as heroes. For 4 years to the day Alkenfal died, the world was controlled by the rough give and take of peaceful politics. Military forces did exist, but they were mostly to control the few outbreaks of violence from zoanoids. Their ability to fight actual prolonged battles was limited. In short, Cronus had traumatized the world so much that the peace the dreamers had hoped for before X-Day was now possible and was now reality. Each year the leaders of the 13 states met in a conference that wasn't for purely photographic purposes. It actually was one of the few political meetings that went some way towards contributing to the well-being of the world's citizens. 8.5 years after X-Day was the day the world was betrayed at the Third World Enclave. The day was codenamed God's Ascension, although that was not known until later. I have said that X-Day was a dark, confusing day for humanity, but that it was honest. For the few people who knew about Cronus, they knew that the domination of the Earth was the main goal of the corporation. Cronus did not hide their intentions. The forces behind God's Ascension betrayed the world, although they learnt a lesson from Cronus and made their conquest brutally fast. Like X-Day, 1 day was all it took. By the time anyone knew what was happening it was all over, although to be fair there was not much bloodshed, though that could be because the world was in less of a position to fight than it was on X-Day. And for all of you who ask the question of why wasn't something foreseen, the answer remains the same. One does not expect war from the one who instigated peace. Today we take back these foothills from the Brazilian dogs. They are the rightful property of the Chilean nation. The commander shouted in Spanish, rallying his men for the day of fighting that was to follow. They were all zoanoids, some ex-Cronus, some processed during Cronus rule, but they were all loyal Chilean fighters and they would all fight to the bitter end for their motherland. In truth, today was planned battle much like any other day, but the commander truly did mean to win the territory of the foothills. With the Third World Enclave beginning today, such a victory would give his leaders an edge over their Brazilian rivals and would show the lowlanders their position in the scheme of things. Besides, a decisive victory today would give him recognition in the eyes of the Chilean people, and then he could truly begin to move within the circles of power. In the disputed foothills that marked a continuously shifting border between Chile and Brazil, the Brazilian commander was giving his troops a similar speech, highlighting for them the need to defend the lowlands before the mountain scum could encroach any further upon their territory, taking their land, their resources, their women. It was all terribly routine, but he too recognized the importance of this day, and he would not allow the ground he controlled to fall to the onslaught of the incompetent mountain goats who sought to take it. Watching proceedings on both sides was a third party, but that was not unusual. Democratic America often sent watchers to ensure that POWs were treated well and that no other atrocities were being committed against civilians. Both commanders were aware of today's third party and had dismissed them, knowing that as long as nothing untoward happened, they would have nothing to report, and with the number of watchers that their troops were reporting, they didn't have a hope of interfering. Morning dawned and the battle began, small skirmishes between troops sent out to reconnoiter the area. The roars and clamor from the zoanoids were a far cry from previous battles of gunfire and explosives. All was proceeding well, along both commanders' battle plans, until disturbing reports came in of their flanking troops acting erratically. Both commanders were moving to investigate when they noticed it. The absolute silence coming from their troops and radios. The sound of nothing when there should have been the sounds of battle, of reports coming from their squad commanders on their progress. Report in. The same order was issued almost simultaneously and was answered in the same way. They can't. The voice came from the sky, echoing throughout the almost 20-mile area of today's battle. They are under my control. Your control? The Brazilian commander questioned incredulously as he made his way from the command tent, searching for the voice's source. Unlike the Chilean commander, he didn't feel it, he couldn't feel it, the subtle yet pervasive pressure upon his mind, forcing him to comply with the silent order to cease fighting and obey that voice from the sky. Ho! The voice questioned, seemingly surprised at the challenge. I am the commander of the Brazilian forces in this area. I am the ruler of this land in the name of the Brazilian people, and I demand that you show yourself, interloper. The Brazilian commander didn't stamp his foot like a petulant child, but he came close. He was standing alone, outside his tent, when he should have been surrounded by his troops, and the feeling that something was wrong was making him brash. Ah! I see now, the voice no longer came from the sky. The Brazilian commander whirled to face the speaker and was shocked to find himself staring at an old man with a long beard and some sort of jewel embedded in his forehead. The man was dressed in long flowing robes and seemed supremely confident as he nodded towards the shadows behind the commander. Two zoanoids came forward and gently, taking care not to hurt their commander, grasped his arms, holding him as a prisoner for the old man. As the commander spluttered, the old man moved forward with a calm smile, replaying memories of X-Day in his mind. There had been more surprise, but it had gone something like this. Your troops are now under my command. Those that, like yourself, are not zoanoids have been contained. Your fight is ended, Commander, because as of now Greater Brazil and unified Chile no longer exist but are part of the greater world nation. You. The Brazilian commander ceased struggling as he finally recognized the man before him. You're meant to be dead. At this, the old man smiled again, somewhat self-depreciatingly. There have been rumors of my death, he said. But Zeus turned out to be a true child of Cronus and wastes no opportunities. No. You can't be Valkis. The commander shook his head. He'd been in the military on X-Day, so he knew what was happening, but he did not understand all that the man before him was telling him. The Thunderbolts said the Zolords were no more, he uttered the denial. He had heard the Lady Shizu give her personal assurances that the Zolords were gone. At this the old man smiled again. Throughout time there have only been 6 Zolords killed, although the world has never seen fit to question Zeus upon this. The Zolords are no more, he echoed the words Shizu had spoken so often. The Zolords are no more because we chose to withdraw from society. We are masters of hiding, and with Lord Alkenful's death we knew our time was limited. Cronus was never one to fight unwinnable battles, we left that to the Thunderbolts, so for now we will bide our time. But I am helping. Yes, I am, because we will regain our power when we liberate the world from the thunderbolts. I have said enough. Valkus waved a hand and the Zoanoids holding the commander dragged their superior officer away. They wouldn't harm him. Despite the presence of the Zolord, these two had instructions from Zeus personally that they were to keep the bloodshed to a minimum. Valkus's eyes unfocused as he reached around the world, touching Zoanoids both old and new as he checked the progress of God's ascension. All was going well. The world's public buildings and other important places were falling in an orderly fashion with very little destruction and bloodshed. So it was with an inward shudder he touched several Zoanoids that were in Zeus' presence, requesting permission to watch through their eyes. He gritted his teeth as he received permission, forcibly reminding himself that time was the only thing that would fix the current situation. New Zoanids. They should never have been, but Zeus had known Cronus still existed, and knowing that humanity could never abandon the Zoanoid technology, he had funded the development of technology that allowed humans to be processed into their Zoa forms without being subjected to the mental control of a Zolord. There were still plenty of Cronus Zoanoids, which was why he was here controlling the South American continent, but there were only new Zoanoids surrounding Zeus. Never! Valkus screamed in the silence of his mind. He should never been humiliated by having to ask permission to enter the mind of a subordinate. He calmed himself when he saw Fukamachi enter the room. This encounter should prove interesting. Guyver I was one of the few who could possibly stand against him, but Mikishima had planned even for this. Ah! Sho, Agito spoke warmly as the younger man entered the room. They were alone for the moment, but his people were all in position watching the proceedings carefully, and what was to follow was even more carefully choreographed than any ballet. You wanted to see me? Fukamachi couldn't keep the question out of his voice as he sat down. While the Thunderbolts had disbanded, for the past few years Agito had always been too busy forming and running the new civilian governments to see Sho and the others who had begun the fight against Cronus with him. The two of them hadn't even talked through the bond of their Guyver units, Sho preferring to live in obscurity, forgetting the fact he even possessed the unit. I did, Agito confirmed, feeling that the smile on his face was forced but knowing that Sho would never see through it. His expression changed as he allowed the tiredness that had been building for the past couple of days show. The last few years have been hectic, he chose the word carefully. You didn't have to supervise everything personally. You know, Sho said with a faint but very uncharacteristic note of scolding in his tone. Mikishima blinked at Fukamachi's words. Perhaps the child was growing up, or perhaps now that they were both adults he considered himself more of an equal. Inwardly, Agito shrugged. At this late stage, it really didn't matter, everything had been taken care of and he was about to silence the last person who could stand in his way if allowed. I know. I just felt better when I did it, he feigned the response a friend would give and was pleased as Sho relaxed further. But I didn't ask to see you to discuss things I already know, he couldn't resist the small jibe. The smaller man didn't even notice it but instead just sat quietly, waiting for Agito to continue. Sho, Agito began again, suddenly very serious. I wanted to see you because my people have found Murakami. Really? Sho surged forward. Well, yes and no, Fukamachi. He's still Imakaram Mirabilis. Is not the Murakami Masaki you knew? I see, Sho said slowly. He looked down at his hands, folded across his lap. Does he even remember being Masaki? I think so. Sho looked up, black eyes unreadable. That's something, he said quietly. When I fought him, he couldn't even remember being Masaki. Agito nodded, narrowing his eyes slightly. He knew Fukamachi had fought the replacement for Gyro but hadn't known that little fact. He would have to have a long talk with Imakaram about that, but for now it was time to move on with the next phase of his plan. He tensed himself. While Fukamachi didn't suspect anything, this next bit had to be perfect or everything could unravel. I know you might not want to, but he did say that he wished to see you, if you are willing. Willing? Sho questioned as if the query was odd. Of course I'd want to see him. Mikishima nodded and the door opened, letting in the ex-freedom fighter. Sho turned, rising to face his friend, a smile of welcoming on his features. Even if Murakami was still Imakaram, still technically the enemy, Cronus was dead and they had been through a lot together. Mirabilis watched as the young man came towards him, completely unaware of the actions of his compatriot. Mikishima had pulled a pistol from a drawer in his desk and was now aiming it precisely. He would be merciful, Sho wouldn't feel the strike that killed him. Murakami, it's been too long. Fukumachi got the greeting out before his world ended. Blam. Ah! Sho was pitched forward as the bullet hit him from behind. Agito's weapon was of a very high caliber. What? The question screamed its way through his mind. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't feel anything. He didn't even feel it as Imakaram drove his claws into his abdomen, supporting his body as the Zolord ripped out his intestines. The lack of feeling was terrifying. It was worse than the pain he should have felt. What? The ripping slashes turned him slightly and he could see the still smoking gun in Agito's hand. No. Ki. He saw her. The way she looked when he placed the ring on her finger, the ring that said he would marry her. Quote. He couldn't speak the words and his reflex gasping to draw air into his lungs merely brought blood into his mouth. Sho crashed to the ground, twitching, but despite his best efforts to say a single word, he couldn't utter so much as a syllable. Agito moved around his desk, watching impassively as Fukumachi's body stilled. It was over, but it wasn't over, but at least the boy hadn't activated his unit. That would have been troublesome. Imakaram raised his hand, flexing his fingers, watching the play of blood over his partially transformed hand. So now we destroy the body? He questioned finally. Mikishima shook his head and, ignoring the blood now staining the carpet, knelt beside Sho, feeling for a pulse. There wasn't one, but he still didn't lower his guard. He snapped his fingers as he rose and several uniformed troops ran into the room, aiming canisters at the fallen form before. At a nod from their leader, they turned nozzles filling the room with a hyper-cold steam. When the initial freezing procedure was over, Agito looked back at Mirabilis. We couldn't destroy the body even if we wanted to, he said in a coldly professional tone that didn't quite cover his annoyance. His unit would have responded to his wounds in a few moments whether he willed it or not. I doubt even the Advents could destroy his body. Now though, it will be frozen in a more permanent manner and then placed in a secure location and guarded by hyper-zoanoids so that no one can awaken him against me. Quote. The man once known as Murakami Masaki nodded before he blinked, receiving reports from several zoanoids spread throughout the world. Mikishima looked at him expectantly after a moment's silence. Valkus reports no problems with the American continents. Europe, Africa and Asia, including the subcontinent, have fallen. Oceania's mostly under control, although it's a bit hard to tell, there are too many small islands for certainty. There is still a small amount of resistance coming from the southern worlds, but that is being taken care of even now and the Enclave is ready to see their new emperor. Quote. Agito smiled thinly. After I change, he said as he strode from the room where several technicians were placing electrodes over Sho's frozen body so that they could monitor him as they prepared the permanent storage facilities. The Emperor had told them how dangerous this individual could be, and even if he didn't look like much, if he warranted the Emperor's personal attention, then he had to be dangerous and they weren't about to take any chances. Can't have the world thinking you killed to get here. Imakaram said softly once Mikishima was gone. Now, can we, Emperor? His use of the honorific was not pretty or in any way respectful. No, I can't, the response came telepathically and carried not even the slightest trace of annoyance or surprise at his underling's tone. Humph. The Enclave was in session, the diplomats and leaders talking animatedly amongst themselves when the far doors burst open, black-clad troops marching with quick precision through the aisles. A few spluttering words of denial was all the noise that was uttered before the room fell into silence, each diplomat eyeing off the sleek and well-muscled forms of the Zoanoid troops. When it became apparent that no one was going to fight, another man entered the room, striding confidently to the newly vacated podium. He too was dressed in a black uniform, the insignia of rank at his throat and an emblem of a stylized lightning bolt over his heart. The captain looked out coldly over the assemblage, taking special care to stare directly into the cameras that had been gathered to film the Enclave. We only rate a captain. The whisper came from several parts of the room in an insulted tone, although all present knew what the armed forces meant. For now, the man said without the slightest trace of emotion. The Emperor will be with you shortly, but he has several things he must attend to personally. There are those who rank above us? The President of Democratic America surged forward. I am not at liberty to discuss the Emperor's actions. Then what are you here for? I am here to inform you of a change in the world government. You are no longer the representatives of the 13 Earth states because there are no longer 13 Earth states, there is only the one world nation, united under the Emperor. And this emperor would be. The man smiled thinly. You will find out in time, he said, glancing towards the door, where a shadow disappeared. The captain nodded slightly before turning back to his audience, his face taking on an even more fixed expression as he prepared to recite the speech he had been sent here for. At 0900 hours our forces ended the war between Greater Brazil and Unified Chile. He looked towards the leaders of those countries. You were both warned of the dangers of using Zoanoid troops in your conflict. The faint scolding tone in his voice disappeared as he continued. An hour later Democratic America fell to the assault of our forces. Europe, Asia and Africa fell shortly after that. There may be a few states in Oceania that have not been suppressed, but their main alliance has fallen. It might have been considered a weakness to admit that they did not have total control, but the emperor had instructed him to tell the absolute truth here, no matter how bad it sounded, and the captain was nothing if not loyal. The final resistance of the southern worlds is being put down even as I speak. God has ascended to the heavens and the world is united under the emperor. We'll fight. A representative of the People's China spoke at a nod from his leader. I doubt that. A new voice spoke from the door, a voice that spoke with such authority that all in the room turned to look. Mikishima. Several of the world leaders cried in relief before they realized he wasn't here to rescue them. Agito strode into the room, nodding slightly at the respectful bow the captain gave him as he moved away from the podium. He was dressed in a similar black uniform, firmly fitted to show off his solid physique, but his was naked of any marks of rank. He didn't need such tokens to distinguish himself from the rest of his forces. Mikishima was flanked by Imakaram and Zektol, the Zoolord dressed in his usual nondescript way, his omnipresent sunglasses covering his eyes, while the hyper-zoanoid wore something that looked suspiciously like the field uniform of a Cronus shock troop, although it did bear the lightning bolt of the thunderbolts. You dare to betray us? Betray you? Agito seemed amused at the question. I have no alliances to any of your nations, so I have not betrayed anyone. He spoke without breaking stride, and as he finished he looked out at the assembly, both hands grasping the sides of the pulpit in a classic position for a speech. He scanned them for a moment, sharp eyes missing nothing and his most cunning smile on his lips. Finally he moved, resting his elbows on the wood and his chin in his clasped hands, unable any more to hold back the smug expression. As some of you have surmised, I am the Emperor. Agito spoke the words in a warm voice of welcoming. And before anyone else starts babbling that I have betrayed you, this is what I have always intended, although I will admit that it has taken longer than I wanted. The last was said with a cold note, daring anyone to contradict him. But this is a speech for the ages, so I should speak to them. Agito gathered himself. What was said now would lay the foundations for his empire, not just for the generations who would hear his words now, but for the generations that were to come, who would be born, live and die under his rule. He was an immortal, eternity was his age, and he intended to rule for that. I will not make any promises about being a good or a bad ruler. In the last decade the world has discovered that there are many definitions of good and bad. I will however promise to be a competent ruler. I have been trained from my youngest days to rule. You have not been trained to rule. You have only been trained to suppress. The voice rang out with conviction from the back of the room, and the speaker stood, fixing Agito with a singularly unimpressed stare. Mikishima waved away his troops who were already moving from the first word to silence this distraction. Aptum, he spoke the name without emotion. I was looking for you. The Zoanoid shrugged, but he never lost the deadly serious expression that was on his scarred face. Where is Fukumachi? He asked suddenly, probing for a reaction from Guyver 3. Show. A thin smile flickered across Agito's lips. A nice try, Aptum. He spoke the words directly into the Zoanoid's supposedly closed mind and was pleased to see him start slightly in surprise. Do not worry, Aptum. I can only speak to you. I cannot control you, but I offer you this chance to join me. Unlike Cronus, I do not care about your supposed failings, I only care about competency, and you are very competent, Aptum. I do not care for your offer, Guyver 3. You claim you have not betrayed anyone, but then where is Fukumachi, because I do not believe he would allow this. I do not know where Fukumachi is. That much was perfectly true. Although he knew where Fukumachi's body would be stored, he did not know how his technicians were planning on transporting it or what route they would take. It had been necessary for him to subdue Guyver I, but after that, anyone could take care of the situation. Aptum shook his head, willing his Zo form into existence. I do not believe you, Mikishima, he whispered, unseating his claws as he leapt forward. No. He's mine. The shouted command served to still the troops who were reacting to protect their emperor. Aptum paused before he growled, dismissing his opponent. I already have your genetic material. You cannot stand against me. Zektal. The Zoanoid held up his claws as he spoke, his form slimmer but reminiscent of Zektal's. Or do you want me to finish the job? Even Mikishima was surprised by Zektal's interference, since the Hyper-Zoanoid had always insisted that he would live to see the day Agito died, and surely this was his best chance. Zektal? He questioned. The Hyper-Zoanoid growled as he transformed. I will see you die, Emperor, for the death of Thancred, but this bastard absorbed Eligen, Gaster and Darzelb, and I will destroy him for that. Quote. While Aptum no longer had a human face, his expression was one of disbelief. Hiding behind the weak? He questioned Mikishima, flexing his claws once again but falling into a battle stance. I will fight you in my own time, Agito responded, stepping back so that there was a small clearing for the two Zoanoids to fight in. His troops pulled back those diplomats who were too stunned to move by themselves, herding them into a corner where they could be controlled more easily. Despite the gravity of the situation, Mikishima noticed as his captain began a head count, quietly making sure that all the world leaders were still present. If one escaped now, they could become a symbol for future resistance, and Mikishima had no desire for that. He reminded himself that it was about time his captain was promoted before he turned back to the impending battle. Zektal was about to get massacred, so he didn't make himself comfortable but rather put himself in a position where he could observe Aptum. He didn't appear to have changed much since the fall of Cronus, but he could control his form. What you saw was not always the truth. Zektal fell into a ready position that mirrored Aptum's, and slowly the two Zoanoids encroached upon each other. Too weak, Aptum hissed at Zektal. His answer was a vicious vertical slash. You are too weak, he tried again. You know it. You are too weak to live in this world, and you know it. Two horizontal slashes followed by an uppercut. Aptum would have smirked as he dodged them, but his Zo form did not allow that. You should have died in Relic's Point. Aptum continued to taunt the black insect-like Zoanoid, nimbly dodging the slashes and small bursts of energy his opponent was releasing. I can do it, you know. I can give you your greatest wish. Aptum allowed his body to change, seemingly melting into his new form. Zektal froze. Eligen. Zektal, the voice that spoke wasn't Aptum's but was indeed the long-dead Hyper-Zoanoid Eligen. I am here, you know. We are all here. You can join us. One purple hand, devoid of claws, reached out in welcome. It's not too late. No. Zektal shook his head as he uttered the denial. You are not Eligen. His voice hardened as he continued talking, his conviction spreading throughout his mind. You can look like him, you can look like any of them, but you are not them. Eligen's long neck flexed, rotating his head as Aptum examined Zektal, his hand still raised to welcome the black Zoanoid. I am here, Zektal. Do you want me to prove it? You cannot prove it because you are not there. I will avenge you, Eligen. I can prove it, Aptum's voice spoke as he jumped back to the line of Agito's troops who were defining their battle ring. The position would allow him at least a few moments to talk. Do you remember the first time? Eligen spoke again. And I don't mean the first time we became Zoanoids. Zektal paused. What? What are you saying? You don't remember? You went to so much trouble. One night of absolute perfection. Everything after was wonderful, but that first time. That first night. There was a catch in Eligen's voice as he spoke, remembering the things that meant so much to him. I will remember it always. You were demanding but gentle, selfish, but you met my needs too. It hurt, but you made me forget the pain. No, you made me accept the pain as the lesser part of pleasure, as the thing which defined the pleasure. Do you remember? No. Zektal snarled. You are not Eligen. Zektal. You promised. You promised me then, Eligen seemed to beg. You promised you would protect me, that you would be with me always. You promised, and now that the chance has come, you are going to pass it up? It's not too late, Zektal, you can still join us. The black Zoanoid growled. You are not Eligen. He said the words slowly, drawing himself up and unfurling his wings. Aptum stepped forward, changing back into his ultimate battle form. Behind him, the Emperor's troops were clearing everyone away, whispering their thanks that the meeting room was several floors up so that it was elevated above the surrounding buildings. "You'll never know, now," he said to Zektol as the hyper-zoanoid began drawing the heat and light from the air. Aptem unfurled his wings. "You think you can defeat me with my own attack?" Zektol questioned. "No. I assimilate the abilities of those whose genetic material I acquire, but I don't assimilate their abilities perfectly. Valkis considered this a failure, but it is this that allowed me to break free of their control. So allow me now to show you what I have made with your attack." Aptem laughed as his wings moved, vibrating rapidly until they were just a blur. At first nothing seemed to happen. The temperature in the room continued to fall as Zektol continued to draw in the latent energy into his body, but slowly the temperature stabilized and then began to rise. "What?" Zektol looked around for the new energy source as his senses were telling him the impossible was happening. Once he unfurled his wings, there was no energy great enough to counter their effect, not even Darzald's fire, or Eligen's shock. Nothing, so the room couldn't be getting warmer, it couldn't. He shook his head. So be it. If the room was getting warmer, then so be it. It just meant there was more energy for him to absorb, and the blast he leveled at Aptem would be bigger. He had vaporized the quasi-zoanoid once, he would do it again, and this time there were no copies. "You're sure you can handle it?" Aptem seemed surprised, but he didn't cease his wings' motions. There was a visible glow around them now, a soft golden haze that simmered and was hard to focus on. "I know your limits. You know nothing." The hyper-zoanoid snarled, bracing himself, forcing the energy in his body to focus. "Ear!" he cried as the protective armor plates over his biolasers slid open and the cells glowed with energy, making Zektol a multifaceted point of light. While he hadn't gathered all the energy in the room he had to fire now, there was only so much energy he could absorb. He smiled to himself, it would be enough. This blast would rival the Guyver's Mega Smasher. Aptem didn't have a chance. "Ho! Wiser than I thought," Aptem said as he watched Zektol preparing to fire. He stilled his wings and retracted them into his body. If Zektol wasn't going to overload himself, then there was no point in flooding the air with further energy, but at the same time he wasn't about to let the hyper-zoanoid fire the contained energy. With a surprisingly happy snarl, he lunged forward, flicking his arm forward and unsheathing his claws. Zektol barely saw the movement and was in no position to try to defend himself. He was bewildered for an instant when Aptem drew back, holding up one hand covered in glowing fluid before his eyes widened and he screamed as the power he was about to release flowed through him, burning his cells from the inside. He stumbled, seeing the wounds on his body and the glowing fluids that covered his armor. "Ugh! Won't!" Zektol gasped against the pain. Aptem had slashed open every fluid-filled sac on his body, the sacs he used to gather and release the energy. They were his focusing crystals for his biolasers, and without them the energy he had gathered was trapped within him. "Won't be defeated." Aptem didn't bother to answer as he closed again, this time using his fists, pummeling the weakened zoanoid through the wounds he had created. He paused before he landed the final blow. "I offered you mercy. I offered you peace. You could have been with me." The voice that spoke now was Eligen's. "But you rejected me." The voice changed back into Aptem's, "and unlike Eligen, I am not so merciful." Aptem landed one final blow, not pulling the force in any way, sending the defeated hyper-zoanoid into the Emperor's troops just left of Agito. Mikishima had a thin smile on his face. "Some very interesting revelations, Aptem," he commented, but made no move towards the rebel. "Humph. You have no idea." There was no hiding the snigger in Aptem's voice. "But neither of us are here to discuss the past. You are right. It is the future that concerns me." Agito nodded as he stepped forward. "I said before I was looking for you, and you have proven that you can serve me far better than Zektol. I am not your enemy, Aptem. I have never been your enemy." "True. But you are my enemy now." Aptem shook his head again as he fell into a combat stance. "You truly do not understand, do you?" There was a note of disbelief in his voice. "Understand?" Mikishima raised one eyebrow. "There is nothing to understand. You don't understand why they fought, do you? Why Fukumachi, a high school student, would take up the fight against Cronus. Why he had the strength to win that fight. Why I fought Cronus and why I will fight you now. Consider for a moment, Mikishima. Consider why I am here." Mikishima frowned. Fukumachi fought because he had no choice. It was fight or be consumed. You fought because Valkis would have killed you if he got his hands on you, and he still might. I have no idea why you are here, nor do I really care. You are in my way. Mikishima was trembling slightly. Now, the only question that remains is whether you are against me, or if you will join me. Hey! Aptum didn't fall out of his ready stance. I never thought I would ever be in a position to say this, but I know I speak for the world when I say, the fight against Cronus was not simply to replace one tyrant with another. I will fight you, Mikishima. Fukumachi will fight you. We will all fight you. I am disappointed, Agito said finally. I thought perhaps you were not so naive. No matter. If you were against me, then you will be destroyed. As Fukumachi was. Mikishima used the instant of surprise to summon his armor. Jumping forward to attack the momentarily stunned Zoanoid. He got in a solid slash penetrating through armor before Aptum recovered. He showed no sign of pain as he danced, avoiding Mikishima's follow-up attacks. It doesn't matter, you know. If you kill me here, I exist elsewhere, so I will continue to fight you. Then I will kill you as many times as it takes. Mikishima responded silently, lining up several shots with his gravity globe, in between firing shots from his headbeam. Aptum wasn't a Zolord, but he was close. We don't have to do this. Agito spoke the words aloud, almost as if he was trying to withdraw from the fight now that it had started. I can give you what you want. And what do I want? Even if Mikishima was intent of keeping some of this conversation private, Aptum had no qualms about sharing it with the world. A Zolord. Aptum paused as Mikishima stepped back with his announcement. The two of them stared at each other for a moment, and when Aptum made no move to respond, Mikishima continued. A Zolord. I can give you one. It's the only Zo form more powerful than your current form, isn't it? I'm not offering you Valkis or Imakarum, I still need them, but there are still 5 you can choose from. Aptum changed back into his human form. He looked at the dark Guyver standing before him before closing his eyes as he considered the offer. Finally he opened his eyes, looking back towards Mikishima with a soft smile. A Zolord, huh? Your price is too high. I'll admit before X-Day I would have accepted it, but having a Zolord crystal would give me more trouble than it's worth. There are too many things I would have to obey, and I have gotten used to my freedom. Aptum's smile became sad, almost resigned. I will not fight you now, Emperor. Fighting you now would be futile, but you know that I will. For now though, I ask you again, where is Fukumachi? The dark Guyver shook his head, raising one hand to fire off a gravity blast. It hit Aptum's human forehead and the Zoanoid fell without a word, sprawling backwards before disintegrating. With a slight growl of frustration, Agito dismissed his armor. For now, Aptum would not be a problem, but his insistent questioning about Fukumachi was going to have to be answered now, and that was not something he wanted to do. I didn't want to fight here either, he reminded himself as he turned back to his waiting audience. Mikishima, you dare? He almost resummoned his armor to blast the voice that spoke. With anger in his eyes he whirled to face the diplomat. I do not dare. I do not betray, I merely do what has been my aim all along. I am Zeus and I will sit upon this world's throne. Agito lost all traces of an urbane politician, becoming a creature of pure cunning with those few words. I am not Cronus. I killed Cronus, but I did it for one reason, and it was not to free the world. Cronus was in my way, and if I could not use them, then I had to destroy them. As Aptum seemed so insistent to point out, I did not fight alone. Fukumachi Sho helped in the battle against Cronus and destroyed many of their Zoanoids and hyper-Zoanoids, but unfortunately in the battle against Alkenfell, Sho was killed, but it was his sacrifice that allowed me victory. You have not known his sacrifice before now because I was respecting him. Fukumachi did not want to fight Cronus. If he could have, he never would have fought anyone, but Fukumachi and Cronus are the past and I am the future. As my captain told you earlier, you are no longer the leaders of the 13 world nations because your nations no longer exist. I am Zeus, son of Cronus, and the world's throne belongs to me. That is how it started. One day and the world fell to the thunderbolts. But as with X-Day, despite all the careful planning that went into God's Ascension, rebels still existed and Aptum's lone charge. Doomed as it was, served as a rallying point for them in the days to come. His words about tyranny ring true. We did not fight Cronus to replace one tyrant with another, and we would not bow to another simply because they helped defeat the first. It seems to me an oversight that Mikishima had nothing planned for my brother and I, but perhaps because he dealt so harshly with Sho, he did not consider us a threat. It was a mistake he would find costly. While I fully admit at the time I was not a good rebel. I could not fight and I have no expertise in battle strategy. My brother's ideas and theories had proven dangerous to Cronus, and with the right tempering they would prove dangerous to Mikishima. The Thunderbolts were not the only rebels fighting against Cronus, they were just the most well-equipped and the strongest of the groups. In the days that followed God's Ascension, the other smaller freedom fighters who had united against Cronus, united now against Agito and my brother, and I joined them. As I said before, I could not fight, I knew no battle plans, but I did know Agito, and when I learnt the truth about Sho I was given the desire to use every low and underhanded thing I could think of against Agito. It may not sound like much, but attending the same school, being vice chairperson on the student council gave me at least some insight into the way he worked. Not enough because I did not foresee God's Ascension, but enough so that I knew some of the small things that truly annoyed our emperor. God's Ascension was a betrayal it took humanity years to recover from, and during that time, the truth about the struggle against Cronus became lost in the emperor's words. In truth, Agito was fair, he was a competent ruler, his training allowed him to make the right base decisions, and during his rule, as with Cronus' rule, the world's population did not go hungry, and except for those involved in rebellion against the government they did not need to fear war. For the ordinary citizen life remained comfortable, but the freedom was gone. God did fall from his throne, but the rebels did not accomplish this. There were other forces at work in this universe, and the time when everyone's eyes would be fixed upon our blue world was fast approaching. Although the desire was strong, in the end Zeus was not destroyed because even a fallen god was needed to fight what came to this planet. End chapter 2, The Conquered. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapter.